in any event, Tina came down with Reggie Pochet in August, and they wanted to talk about how we would move forward this year. And Tina said, you know, Bill, you've never talked about the history of the Mississippi River. And so I said, well, we can remedy that this year. So we're going to talk about the colonization of the Mississippi River by Europeans and give a little history before that. And then I particularly want to focus on Jacques Esnould de Livaudais, who was a key figure in the development of understanding the Mississippi River and documenting the river. Just a fascinating man. So let's see. Should I point it this way? There we go, Spanish exploration. Let's see now. Darn. No. Here we go. So here you could see a map that we borrowed from the internet that shows two very important people, the work of Hernando de Soto and then his successor, Luis de Moscoso. Hernando de Soto explored the southern part of what is today the United States between 1539 and 1542. He was a conquistador, as you all know, and a great explorer. And he actually discovered Florida and surveyed the Bahamas and died along the Mississippi River in 1542. So let's see now if we can. See, I'm going to get it yet. So here we have an allegory. I can assure you that when Hernando de Soto met indigenous Native Americans, there was not so glorious a reception as that. But in any event, still, the Spaniards really had claim before France to all of what is today the Gulf Coast of the United States. So in any event, and there he is, Puerto de Soto. And then he died, as I said, on the shores of the Mississippi River in 1542. And then it fell to this man, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado, to succeed him. He had been selected by Hernando de Soto, and he actually saw for the first time the mouth of the Mississippi River more or less close at hand from the water. Because remember, De Soto died upriver in the vicinity of Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi. We really don't know where exactly. But in any event, of course, the first Spaniard to see the Mississippi River was Panfilo Narvaez. And he actually saw the river in 1527, 28. But he was out in the Gulf of Mexico. And for those of you who have been deep sea fishing and gone out around the mouth of the river, you'll recognize the mud lumps that one sees at different times of the year. Well, Narvaez wrote that the Native Americans had told him that there was a great river that entered into the Gulf, but that the river was inaccessible because of the palisadas, the palisades, the walls, which were mud lumps full of trees and other debris. So really, the first name that the Europeans gave to the Mississippi River was the Rio de la Palisada, the palisaded river. And then, of course, Hernando de Soto called it the River of the Holy Spirit. So this is a Spanish archival map of 1717. And if you look at it, you can well see that, let's see if I can figure this out. Well, I'm not going to do it. If you look at it, you can well see the mouth of the river up to the kind of middle right of the screen. And many cartographic historians have told me that they believe that might be the Atchafalaya River. But my point is, you can see just how little was known about the Mississippi River by the Spaniards. It was something that they just knew very little, absolutely almost nothing about. So now we come to the French colonization, the founding of New Orleans in 1718, which was the year after 1717, the date of that Spanish map. So here we have the Jacques Belin map of 1766 that shows the Atlantic Basin, the Caribbean, and what I still choose to call the Gulf of Mexico. And you could see to the left, Louisiana, and you can see how it connects ultimately to Africa and to Europe. And of course, coming from Africa were the enslaved people from Senegal, from Ghana, from the Congo. And then of course, you had the people leaving La Rochelle in France coming to Louisiana. La Rochelle was a very important mercantile city, and it had great connections to the New World. And then, of course, you also see Canada or Nouvelle-France. So this is a very important map, and it shows you how much more knowledge had been acquired between 1717 and 1766. So as we go forward, this is a 1729 map of the mouth of the Mississippi River. It's considered more or less accurate, and it appears to have been done by Marc-Antoine Caillot, who came as an employee of the Company of the Indies to Louisiana in 1729. He had come from a suburb of Paris called Meudon and was of the minor nobility, and he left a wonderful memoir, which was translated and published by the Historic New Orleans collection of his time in New Orleans. It's very revealing. So there you see the very earliest known map European map, French map of Louisiana, of the mouth of the river in Louisiana, rather. Now, can you imagine all of these sailboats gathered at the mouth of the river, waiting for pilots to come from the Balize in order to guide the ships from the mouth of the river to New Orleans? So this is the view, 1729, when Marc-Antoine Caillot comes here. The next view is the 21st century. So you see, things have changed in 300 years, haven't they? So in any event, now the next thing will be La Balise. La Balise is French, and it means the lighthouse. It was the light that mariners looked for as they were approaching the mouth of the river on the way to New Orleans. So it was the first thing that Perrier saw, the first thing that so many French who came to Louisiana saw soon after the establishment of New Orleans in 1718. We believe that this profile dates to about 1722, and it shows the cannon which was used to announce that the ships were entering the pass. Now, this is a very interesting image. This is of the Côte-de-Gare, literally the police station at the Balize. You know, with all of these sailors and different people coming through on their way to New Orleans, there were times when it was important to have a Côte-de-Gare. This plan, we believe, was done by Bernard de Vergès, who was an early engineer in Louisiana, and we believe that this is the first plan that shows what we would ultimately identify as Creole vernacular architecture, with the gallery in front, the way that the gallery is incorporated into the roof line. This is the very beginning of a style of architecture which deviated, say, from the Ursuline Convent, which is the oldest documented structure remaining in the Mississippi Valley. You see a real difference in this and in that convent. And buildings like the convent were what predominated in the early French period in New Orleans. And of course, this is what the Balize looked like about 1819. This watercolor was made by Benjamin Latrobe, the architect for the capital of the United States, and considered the father of architecture in the United States. So this really continued to be a very important feature until the Eads jetties, which came about in the 1870s. Despite hurricanes and despite the many times that the Balise was destroyed. You know, it's very interesting. Marc-Antoine Caillot wrote in 1729, as he passed ultimately the Balise, that he despaired of the future of New Orleans and Louisiana, that this part of Louisiana was surrounded by water, and he said, and I quote, "And I am certain at some point water will claim it all." So, this is the Newbury map of 1723, about 1723. It's the earliest map that shows New Orleans and the area of New Orleans 50 leagues above the city and 50 leagues below the city, going all the way, believe it or not, below Pointe-à-l'Arche on this map. And so you could see the fledgling city of New Orleans. It's in red. And if you look in the back, you'll see Bayou St. John and you'll see Lake Pontchartrain. Through much of the year, throughout the early 19th and all of the 18th century, throughout much of the year, the mouth of the river was impassable because of flooding. You'd never know it today to look at the Mississippi River, but in those days, it flooded quite extensively. And so it made the passes of the river largely impossible to get through. So there was something that evolved called the lake trade, which connected Mobile, which was an early capital of Louisiana, Biloxi, and New Orleans. And so actually the boats sailed along the Gulf Coast, finally into Lake Borgne, through the Rigolets, into Lake Pontchartrain, and then down Bayou St. John, which was named in honor of Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, the founder of New Orleans. So in any event, there was a second portage on Bayou St. John, and to this day, you can go to Bayou St. John and you can see a historical marker where Bell Street meets Moss Street, and that was where the original aduana, the original custom house, and so many things were located associated with the port of New Orleans. And then also, very interestingly, before there was a city of New Orleans in 1718, beginning in 1709, Canadian French, particularly Antoine Rivard de la Vigne and Etienne Roquigny, were the recipients of land grants along Bayou St. John, around City Park Avenue. Rivard de la Vigne had the property that very much included the fairgrounds in New Orleans. So before there was a city of New Orleans, there were a few French Canadians living on the shores of Bayou St. John. So it actually rather predates the city. Now the next image is, and I'm sorry about the quality of this, the next image you'll see, I'm just gonna have to walk because I can't get this thing to work, you know. I just can't help being a dinosaur, and it's me, not This is the entrance to English Turn right here. Today we call that English Turn, but it is not English Turn, it is the downriver entrance. The depth of English Turn is up here. And that is Poydras today, and as a matter of fact, that's the property in large measure of Sidney Torres. That's Carnarvon. And so English Turn, really fascinating place. In August of 17, I think it was August of 17. No, it was September 15th, 1699. Captain Bond had come from Charleston. He was determined to establish a British presence on the Mississippi River. So he left from Charleston. So far as the British were concerned, everything west of Carolina belonged to Great Britain, including what would become the city of New Orleans. And remember, Robert Cavelier de La Salle came and discovered the mouth of the river and claimed the river and the Mississippi Valley for Louis XIV and named Louisiana La Louisiane for Louis XIV. But from 1682 until the arrival of Bienville and his elder brother Iberville, nothing was done by the French to colonize the region. And the British were aware of this. So the British had come up, they were in a corvette ship with 10 guns. They'd come up and they had been stalled in that perfect 180-degree turn in the Mississippi River. And they were waiting for the wind to be able to move them out of English Turn. And this was not unusual. This was still another reason that the lake commerce and the lake route to the city of New Orleans was so important. So Bienville found out about it. He wore his finery. He was 19 years old. And as a ruse de guerre, he tricked the British. He told them that the French were firmly established upriver, that they were trespassing on French property, and they had best leave. So the English turned around, literally, d'été aux Anglois, d'été des Anglois, in the old French today, and more modern French, d'été des Anglais, or English turn. So just think, it wasn't the first time that an untruth was used to make history in Louisiana. But if the British had come here, it certainly would have been an entirely different outcome. So, these things that these maps show are just fascinating to me. This is a view of New Orleans in 1730 by Dumont de Montigny. And you could see just how primitive the city of New Orleans facing the river is. This is actually taken from what we call today Algiers Point, though in those days the point was maybe 3/4 of a mile into the river, because the point has been an écart bank, a bank that's been losing land since the time immemorial. And then where the French Quarter is today, that's been a batture bank. That's been the bank that's been building out and out and out over a period of time. So, but you could see really the city only went back about 4 blocks. The original grid was laid out by Leblanc de la Tour in 1721. And so you could see by 1730, very much a fledgling place. New Orleans was. This is from the archives of the St. Louis Cathedral, and this is the marriage, it's on the left, of Jacques Esnould de Livaudais and Marie-Geneviève Babin de la Source. He was a native of Saint-Malo. He was born, he was born Jacques-Julien Esnould de Livaudais. The family name is Esnould, and it's a Breton French name. And then Livaudais was the name of an estate which one still finds in the vicinity of Saint-Malo, where he was born in 1696, and he was baptized with his sister March 2nd, 1698. Livaudais arrives in New Orleans about 1728, and then Livaudais functioned as, so far as I know, the first official captain of the port of New Orleans. And he was in that capacity by 1733. So the next thing we'll look at, there are no portraits that survive of Livaudais. He was very well off, but there are no portraits that survive of him. But you could see here the specimen of his handwriting. He was very highly educated, and as a matter of fact, he was educated, and he really educated himself. Really just a fascinating figure. In this document, he's certifying that he received from Monsieur Dumont de Montigny 2 bateaux, 2 large wooden skiffs. And it is dated April 27th, 1737. And the original of this document is in the archives of the Superior Council of New Orleans, which is housed today in the Louisiana State Museum. Now, this is perhaps one of the most fascinating documents, something that was called to my attention many years ago by a cousin, Greg Livaudais, who has been the comptroller at Martin's Wine Cellar for many years, but always very interested in the history of the family. He got a hold of this document and shared it with me, and what we find in the document is it's a report dated November 24, 1746, addressed to Governor Livaudais, who was at that point the governor of Louisiana. In this report, he discusses the perils of bringing vessels, even when the mouth of the river and the passes were indeed passable by ships, the perils of bringing the ships upriver and how difficult it was to get them through the passes. So what he recommends in this document, more than 125 years before James Buchanan Eads and his jetties at the mouth of the river, is the construction of wooden siding, wooden revetments, if you will, that would channel the force of the river into the Gulf, and that the force of the river would scour out the passes. So here we have an example of someone with great vision, great foresight, and remember, the Eads jetties would not be realized until 1876, 1877. So it's something that has always fascinated me. And I think it also shows, in some respect, the apathy of the French to Louisiana, because many, many times the French here were left to fend for themselves. And so there were many things that the French could have done like this to make New Orleans grow and to make it ultimately more competitive. But everything comes in good time, and so this came in good time too. This is the memoir by the Sieur de Livaudais. It's dated 1758. There is no exact date. And in this memoir, he is requesting the Cross of St. Louis, the Croix de Saint Louis. He's requesting to be made a Knight of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis in recognition of his services over many, many decades to the French crown. So it begins in 1706, you can see at the top. Livaudais is then 10 years old. He embarks from his native Saint-Malo as an apprentice to begin privateering under the orders of his uncle, Lavine Voisin, who was a very famous, or to some infamous, privateer. So whenever I've spoken to our Livaudais cousins, I always tell them that, you see, we do sometimes have that spirit of a corsair in all of us to this day. In 1708 and 1710, again a teenager, Livaudais sails in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean pursuing privateering. At this point, he's reading Spanish literature, and he is becoming completely fluent, speaking, reading, and writing the Spanish language. And this ultimately made him absolutely indispensable to France as it established its presence here, its colonial presence here. Then in 1711, still a young teenager, Livaudais becomes a second lieutenant and ensign aboard various privateering ships. And remember, these people sailed with letters marked, meaning that they were licensed by Louis XIV, Louis XIV, to plunder and pillage in the name of the French crown. And then they would keep a part of whatever they seized. So in any event, then in 1712, Livaudais, who by this time is 18 years old, arrives in Mobile in Louisiana for the very first time, beginning to learn about the waterways of this region. He was instantly fascinated by the tropical lushness and the density and also by the Native Americans. The whole environment of Louisiana at this point just utterly intrigued him. So, at the same year in 1712, he went with his uncle, Livaudais, to intercept a Portuguese pirate ship, which was beginning to attack Cartagena de las Indias, which is today in Colombia, and it was one of the great ports of the Spanish Empire in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, and the 18th century. And it's still a very important city in Colombia, very intact. So the 100-man crew from Portugal lost almost all of its crew. There were only 30 people remaining alive at the end of this encounter between the French, Livaudais and Livaudais, and the Portuguese. So, long story short, the Livaudais said that he would remain in the Caribbean at Saint-Domingue, which is today Haiti, and he suggested that his nephew, Livaudais, bring the ship, the Portuguese ship, back to Europe with its bounty. And so it was divided between Spain and France. So this will give you an idea of what an incredible young man he was, and the adventures that he had. It's just remarkable to imagine that someone like him would be the ancestor of every Livaudais descendant in Louisiana. Then in 1728, Livaudais and Governor Parish, who was the governor sent here by the Company of the Indies, traveled to Mobile to meet with the Commandant of Pensacola, where they learned about the availability of cattle. It turns out that the colony was on the verge of starving. Had it not been for the Native Americans teaching the French how to hunt game, ducks, venison, how to fish, we would have starved. So in any event, finally an effort was made by Livaudais, who spoke Spanish, to go to Pensacola and east of Pensacola in order to find the cattle. Regretfully, the British got to the cattle before he did. So he had to return to Louisiana empty-handed. But the precedent was set that Livaudais would represent periodically the colonial French government with the Spanish colonial officials in Pensacola and in Veracruz in order to procure flour, cornmeal, cattle, livestock. You know, really long before Louisiana became a Spanish colony, we were very much reliant, not completely, but very much reliant on the good graces of Spain. And all of this because Bourbons, or Bourbons, were reigning in both France and Spain concurrently. And of course, not only was there the bond of the Catholic faith, which drew the Spaniards ultimately and the French together, but also there was the bond of this royal family. They were all descendants of the Habsburgs as well. And the fact that their number one enemy, their number one person who contended to take over their empire was Great Britain. So all of this went on many, many years before Louisiana became Spanish, many, many years before the Galvez expedition in the American Revolution, many years before the Battle of New Orleans. And what was key to everything was making certain that Great Britain did not get control of the Mississippi River and the Mississippi Valley. Because remember, that river is one of the largest in the world. It drains fully about a third of the North American continent. And while France never knew quite what to do with us, nevertheless, she did not want the British to get a hold of it. So anyway. Now this is the next page of that memoir, and if you look at the top, near the top it says 1730. Livaudais made many expeditions all over this region. And in 1730, he says in that entry, I examined or I traveled in the environs of the port of New Orleans, and I discovered there a flat land, which I named in 1730 Barataria. So he is the one, a lover of Cervantes. He is the one who named Barataria. So I just think it's really fascinating. And of course, you can see I'm very proud of him. I think he's a great man, or was a great man. And then, of course, as we look over and see different other things, after 1730, in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, he traveled to the Chandler Islands. He was the first person to even try to fathom, the first European to try to fathom Lake Borgne. He went to Bayou La Fourche. He went to Lake Maurepas, and tried to begin to explore and document that area. So in short, by 1758, there was no one in the colony of Louisiana, probably no European anywhere, who knew more about the Mississippi River than Jacques Esnould de Livaudais. And then finally, of course, he was made a Chevalier de Saint-Louis, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. Now, this is very interesting. This is a work that was done by Philip Pittman. He was an engineer in the service of Great Britain, and the work is entitled The Present State of European Settlements on the Mississippi, and it's dated 1770. It was published in London. And this book is one of many different works which had come to the attention not only of France, but also of Spain. By the 1750s, the economy of Louisiana under the French had become so broken that merchants from Philadelphia, New York, Boston had come to New Orleans, and they had completely taken over the economy of Louisiana. And then, of course, when the Spaniards came here, they gasped. I mean, here were all of these Scotsmen, Irishmen, some English, who were successful merchants working with our people, and so this had to be brought to an end. So in any event, as you see, as we go on in this work, this is a map of New Orleans in 1770 that Philip Pittman, Captain Pittman, the engineer, made. Now look at this map. There's a key to it in the upper left-hand corner. It shows you where the powder magazines are, the king's warehouses. It shows you the wall that was wooden and the different fortifications that surrounded the city of New Orleans. This was not merely an academic exercise. The British had their eyes on New Orleans. And you can see it here in 1770. And then we see these maps that are also in Philip Pittman's work. And you see it begins down at the bottom. You see it says La Balise. It goes up the river. You see English Turn. You see the city of New Orleans. And it goes all the way up past Natchez to St. Louis. So why were the British doing this? Again, this was not an academic exercise. So the British understood, as did France and as did Spain, that whoever held New Orleans controlled the mouth of the Mississippi River. And whoever controlled the mouth of the Mississippi River controlled access to the Mississippi Valley. It's just that simple. So I think this is very interesting to see. And then just so we're coming to the end of this, thank God for all of you. We see that Livaudais dies May 6, 1773. He was 78 years old, and he was buried in the cemetery in New Orleans that was on St. Peter Street. And to this day, those of you who are tour guides, you know, ever so often in that particular block, they'll be doing excavations or digging for plumbing or whatever, and they'll come up with human remains. That's from this cemetery. So we know he was buried here. And then his wife survived him by 20 years, died in New Orleans June 23rd, 1800, at the age of 88 years. So she was younger than he. And she is buried in the St. Louis Cathedral. Now, the oral tradition in some branches of the Livaudais family is that Jacques and Livaudais' remains were exhumed from the St. Peter Street Cemetery, as many call it, and were reinterred in the cathedral, but I have not found proof of that. But anyway, I think it's just fascinating also about his wife, because they were some of the founders, the Babin de la Source was some of the founders of Mobile in 1702. So when you see the widow Livaudais dying in 1803, just think she saw the very beginning of Louisiana when it was French. Then she saw it transition to Spain. Then she was living and knew that Louisiana was going to become, was going to be transferred from Spain to France, and probably from France to the United States. So such a life that she lived. And she was very much the matriarch of a huge family. She had multiple sons and daughters, so that today there's the Esnould de Livaudais de Beaumont branch of the family, Esnould du Gay Livaudais, Esnould family, Esnould Livaudais, Livaudais Esnould. I mean, there are all these different branches of the family, and they all descend from these two people. And not only are there descendants of these people still living in Louisiana, but also in France, because the families went back and forth a great deal. So anyway, after, of course, Livaudais also established a corps of pilots, river pilots, who would escort the vessels, as I mentioned earlier, from the mouth of the river up to New Orleans. Well, this practice was retained by Spain, and Manuel Ronquillo was the long-term Spanish captain of the port of New Orleans. And of course, there are many Ronquillo, of course they call themselves now Ronquillo, but there are many Ronquillo descendants all over this region. And then of course, one of his very well-known and very accomplished bar pilots was Domingo Ragas. And of course, today, the family is called Regas, and it seems that they were from the Balearic Islands in Spain, but we're not quite certain. But so anyway, very interesting. As I conclude this presentation, I have to thank my cousin Greg, who was so kind to consult with me when he was doing all this research, and I was able to share different information with him, and we had a wonderful collaboration. But he ultimately is the one who put together so much of this information, which is a great, great, great service to everyone who's interested in the history of Louisiana. His direct line is very interesting. He descends from François Esnould de Livaudais, who was one of the sons of Jacques and Marie Geneviève. He married Pélagie Vaugine. Her sister, Victoire Vaugine, married Chalmette. So they were brothers-in-law, Chalmette and Livaudais. He had several sons. One was Jean Balthazar Esnould de Livaudais, and he settled at Bayou Terre-Haubert along with his father, Francois, in the original St. Bernard Parish. And then he fought in the Battle of New Orleans. And then he had a son, Francois Bernard Livaudais. Then his son was Albert Esnould de Livaudais. And Albert Livaudais was actually educated at the Collège Jésuite, which we call today Jesuit High School. And he became an attorney and a judge. And then it was his son, Oliver Stanislaus Livaudais, who founded Bournemouth Realty Company. here in St. Bernard Parish. And then Reggie was Greg's grandfather, and he was one of the sons of Oliver Livaudais. So anyway, now you know something more about the family than you ever wanted to. And of course, Rachel Seager, and we have a wonderful father here. She was very patient and helped me to put all this together. So I have to thank and acknowledge her for her help. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
You mentioned the name Voisin several times.
Mm-hmm.
Is that V-O-I-S-I-N?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Was the old plantation house on Jefferson Highway somewhere near Central Avenue connected to that family?
La Ville Voisin, so far as I know, never settled in Louisiana. He certainly was very active in the Gulf and in the Caribbean, but he never lived here. It was his nephew who lived here. There were other Voisins who came here, and I don't know that they were from Brittany. But you know, it's very interesting. Saint-Malo was the birthplace of a large number of French colonists who came to Louisiana, and they were amongst the most industrious of the colonists. One was Jean-Baptiste Massey, who had an early plantation at Barataria, and in the 1730s, he actually experimented with cultivating down there cotton, hemp, and other crops. Tobacco, indigo became the cash crop. Other people from Saint-Malo were the Marais brothers. There was Marais Dupuis, who was the original owner of what would become the line Jackson. That was a land grant given to him in 1723. And then his brother, Pierre Marais de la Tour, owned the property downriver. And of course, that became part of the Marigny and the Chalmette family holdings later. So, and of course, it was there at Chalmette in 1723-22 that the Marais brothers, before they actually were given formal possession of the property, cultivated two of the first indigo crops in Louisiana. Indigo was used to make blue dye, as you no doubt know. So, any other questions? Yes.
Okay, so Livaudais married Celeste Barony, who, of course, sells the plantation to Samuel Peters, which becomes the garden district. So with that Livaudais, where is he in line to Livaudais?
All right, he would be a son, as I recall, because he's my direct ancestor too, you know, all the inbreeding. He was a son, another son of Jacques Livaudais. He was a brother of Francois Livaudais. And then he married, it was Charlotte Chauvin-Delary des Îlets, the Delarys. So anyway, and so that, but then interestingly enough though, that areas of the Garden District actually can be traced to the original Jacques-Esnould Livaudais. So there was a continuum of ownership of that land by the Livaudais family from the early 1700s until Marie Celeste sold the property. And you know, it was a terrible thing. She married Jacques-François Esnould de Livaudais, and apparently he drank too much. So she tired of him because she had her own money from her brother and her father. And so she decided that she would divorce him. And then she retired to Paris, where she lived in Montparnasse. And she had a very elegant salon in Paris. And she's buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery. And then she and Bernard were the surviving siblings, brother and sister from Pierre-Philippe de Marigny and Jeanne-Marie d'Étreon. And it's very interesting. He actually left New Orleans, Bernard, in 1864 to sail to France in order to be with his sister because he had been told that she was nearing the end of her life. So he had an interesting time with her while he was there in 1864, 65. So, all these stories about these families, huh? Any other questions? Yes. Yes. Oh, definitely. Livaudais was among them, though many of his maps have not survived. But oh, no, the Spaniards they were completely conversant. Once the Spaniards got a foothold on the Mississippi River, they were determined to develop Louisiana, as they called it, as a barrier to British colonial expansion. And that's why the Canary Islanders, the people from Malaga who founded New Iberia, and the vast majority of Acadian survivors of the British from Acadie, that's why all those people were settled in Louisiana at the expense of the Spanish crown in order to develop Louisiana as that barrier to British colonial expansion. Is very important. And they understood very well the Belle Riviere, which was an old name for the Ohio River. They knew they were every bit as knowledgeable as the English. But my point is, the English were very knowledgeable. And they didn't have that knowledge, as I said earlier, just as an academic exercise. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
So John Peel was the next riverboat pilot at the Livaudais?
He was captain of the port under the Spanish period, yeah.
So where was his property?
He lived mostly in Plaquemine Parish, and he had a house in what is called today the French Quarter. And he was married several times. His last wife was Maria Artiles, who was the widow of Diego Estopanol, who was the founder. So she and he were the progenitors of the Estopanol family in Louisiana. And she died in 1808, and she is not buried in St. Bernard. She's buried in St. Louis, #1. Any other questions? Well, I can't thank you all enough. I hope I haven't bored you too much. Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you.
Let me get this out of the way so that you can get up here.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I would just like to close out the night by introducing myself. I'm Reggie Pochet, so just one more French surname of a night of many French surnames. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and I want to ask that you stay tuned for additional programming. And by the way, I am, just so I can introduce myself formally, as Nunez's interim Vice Chancellor for Strategic Partnerships and Engagements. So part of my job is to help bring events like this off, but also add to our college's mission. You know, obviously, as a college, we are here to educate our students, provide them with the skills and knowledge they need, hopefully to find prosperity for themselves and their families by getting a good job. But another part of our mission is to enrich the lives of the entire community, and that's why we host events like this. And that's why we want to do additional services to the community that will, allow them to see what we do, but also to enjoy having an experience such as this. So stay tuned for announcements for a series of leisure courses that we're planning on offering to the community. Courses in our fine arts department, for example, also courses in the skilled trades, courses that intersect with the programs that we currently offer. I promise a lot of them are very interesting. If anyone has any ideas of leisure courses you would like to experience with Nunez, if we can pull it off, we will do it. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and safe travels back home.